The last thing he said before sliding the paper toward me was, "Sign this or pack." His voice was calm, too calm, like he was offering a reasonable choice between two equally sensible options. I had stood in that kitchen 1,000 times, making coffee, packing lunches, listening to promises. None of them had sounded like an ultimatum before. The document was a deed amendment, thick with lawyerly language, and the signature line was circled in a way that made my stomach drop. A portion of my late father's property, the land and the house that had felt like the only truly solid part of my life, would be legally transferred to him, and by extension, to his brothers. He'd crafted it so neatly that, on paper, it looked like a simple business decision. In life, it looked like betrayal. "You're asking me to steal from my family," I said, slow, the words coming out like they had to be coaxed. My hands were steady even though my heart was not. "You want me to take what my brothers and I inherited from Dad and hand it over to you and your family? For what? A bigger house? A weekend boat? Is that what this is worth to you?" He shrugged, the movement practiced and casual. "It's worth the house. It's worth peace. You wanted the marriage, Emma. You wanted to be part of my world. Now you can show you're committed. Or leave." He said the last word like it was a courtesy. The light over the kitchen sink pooled across his face, throwing the years he'd hidden into sharper relief. He looked younger in photographs, more handsome, the way manipulators do, someone you can imagine yourself building a life with. Up close, the charm was gone. What remained was a man used to getting his way, and a plan that had been hatched long before that dingy stack of documents found its way onto our oak table. I set the paper down without touching it. I let the silence stretch, the clock beating between us. For a long time I imagined I'd collapse, sob, beg him to take back his words. I'd pictured dramatic fights, lawyers, threats. What I hadn't pictured was that quiet, the engineered composure in his voice that said he'd already worked out the math in his head and found my value lacking. "You did this on purpose," I said. "You've been planning this. Who helped you? Your brothers? Your lawyer? Did you write this while I was at work, paying for things that you now want to reassign?" He didn't look guilty. He looked tired of explaining. "It's not theft, Em. It's a restructuring. The property won't be taken from your brothers, not immediately. This is a contingency. If you sign, we'll reinvest, we'll build. It benefits everyone." His pitch was soft, threaded with the language of investors. He'd always known numbers better than people. "It benefits your brothers," I said. "Not mine." He leaned forward now, hands splayed on the table as if to emphasize reason. "You know how the world works. You studied art history while I deal with balance sheets. You either stand with me as we expand or you walk away and let the house be divided. This is practical." Practical. That little word sounded like betrayal wrapped in aluminum foil. I caught myself picturing my brother Tom's face, the way he always whistled when he came home from work, the scar on his knuckle where he'd once fallen from a roof, the joke he told that made us all laugh until we cried. I pictured the old house, the chipped banister, my mother's smell in the carpets, the windows that looked over the creek where we fished as kids. This land was more than a line on a ledger. It was memory. It was my father's last good joke, his stubborn refusal to leave the basement without fixing the water heater himself. "You can't make me do this," I said finally. "You can't blackmail me with either a marriage or a deed." "It's not blackmail," he said, and for an instant the conversation felt like it was slipping into some other language. "It's an ultimatum. We either build as a unit, or we're just two people living independently. I won't have you dithering on the sidelines anymore, Emma. I need clarity." What he called clarity was cruelty disguised as decisiveness. He had given me two futures. One where I kept my family's legacy and watched my marriage unravel, and another where I surrendered a piece of my lineage to save a relationship that had begun to feel less like a partnership and more like a ledger entry. In that instant, I hated him, not for the first time, but with a new, I know you now clarity. I hated his casual willingness to recode my life's value into dollars and property. I hated the way he minimized theft with words like restructure and contingency. I hated that he thought he could purchase my compliance by staging it as rational. And beneath the hate was an ember of something far more dangerous: resolve. Sign it, I told him, voice flat. Sign it, and we're done tonight. But if you want me to sign, do it in the presence of a notary. Do it where it counts. He blinked. Why? If you sign, so it's official, I said. Not a conversation we have while the kettle is boiling and the kids are at school. If you want this legally, fine. But I want it signed and witnessed. Everything in him tightened. You're playing games. No, I said. I'm making sure you're serious. I won't sign anything in private. I rose and walked to the window, training my gaze on the street where the maple leaves were beginning to redden. The last thing I wanted was to hand him leverage. The last thing I wanted was to pick up a phone someday and learn he'd quietly taken the property I'd once called ours. He watched me like a man calculating the odds. So the choice is legal signature, public, or you're leaving? He asked again. There it was, the trap. The ultimatum repeated, only now he'd wrapped it in legal formality, convincing himself it was the moral path. But ultimatums are almost always one-sided. If you let someone dictate the terms of your life, you've already lost. I could see the soft world we'd moved in together: bookcases, Sunday coffee, small compromises, and how his plan had been quietly shifting the compromises until they were all mine. I thought of the years I'd worked, part-time shifts at the gallery, freelance curations, nights spent writing proposals. I thought of the sacrifices I hadn't registered as sacrifices. The shows I'd missed to pick up a kid from soccer. The way I'd swallowed my own ambitions to keep the peace. I thought of my brothers and how they'd trusted me to stand for what belonged to our family. I thought of my father's last words, gruff and honest. Look after this place, Em. Don't let it go easy. The word revenge felt too neat, as if it were a movie trope. What I felt was more precise than revenge. It was reclamation, surgical, patient, and cunning. If he wanted war, he'd asked for it. If he wanted to reassign land for a sense of control, then he would see how costly that control could be. Sign it in public, I said. Bring your lawyer. Bring mine. If you're so sure this benefits everyone, we'll do it right. If not, you can show me where it says you have that right now. There was a small thrill in my voice at the end, like the crack of ice underfoot. I was baiting him, and he was already close enough to bite. He hesitated, scowling. But he agreed, because he saw the advantage of the optics. Public, witnessed, and therefore unavoidable. If he really believed he was acting in good faith, he would welcome muscle. If he wasn't, being forced into the light might wring out his confidence like a wet dish rag. The next morning I called Tom and Mark. We grew up in this town, our brothers, and I had the kind of bond that was messy and honest. I didn't tell them everything, only the parts that mattered, the parts that would make them listen. An ultimatum had been offered, a property interest was at risk, and the man they had once fondly called their brother-in-law had presented the option like a business deal. There is a certain clarity in the way vulnerability is weaponized. It turns people into measures. I wanted my brothers to know that measure was being calculated with them as the variable. Tom came over with coffee, cheeks flushed from his early morning run. He read the draft I'd typed up on my laptop, no melodrama, no showbiz. Just facts, the document, the terms, the ultimatum. Mark's face grew tight as he scanned, then softer as his hand found mine across the table. "You're not going to sign anything now, right?" Tom asked, the question a protective instinct he'd always had. "No," I said. "Not until we see lawyers. Not until everything is aired." He nodded. "He's overreaching. But a lot of men are hungry when they think they can get more without risk." That night I lay awake, thinking not about how to retaliate with fireworks, but how to dismantle the scaffolding of his claim. He'd positioned himself as a partner. He'd taken the language of partnership, the shared mortgage advice, the community of us speech, and now enlisted legal tools to turn that sentiment into property control. To beat that, I'd need to carefully and publicly prove that his version of partnership was false, that our marital status and previous agreements didn't constitute the unilateral authority to reassign family inheritance. In other words, I needed to take his publicness and weaponize it against him. For 2 days I moved through my life like a chess player. I met with lawyers who were kind in a clinical way. There is a breed of attorney whose voice sits at the same pitched calm as those who issue ultimatums. "If there's any suggestion of coercion," one of them said, flipping through the documents he'd requested, "we can have this voided. If you were pressured or misled, then a court will see that as duress." The word duress tasted like hope. It also tasted like danger, because to prove duress requires proof of pressure, of a climate where consent was manufactured and not free. That meant I'd need to show not just the document, but the context, the phone records, the emails, the meetings when he'd insisted we remap our holdings like a CEO trimming a corporate board. I would need witnesses. I would need time and patience, and for him to act openly and carelessly, exactly what he was prone to do. I met with a forensic accountant, too. Numbers are not moral, but they are persuasive. If his brothers had benefited from certain transfers or if every decision had been processed through his family's shell companies, it would show pattern and intent. The woman at the accounting firm asked quiet, excellent questions about flows of money, passive income, and whether there were any pre-existing trusts tied to the property. Her eyes bored into me as if she could see the blueprint forming behind my resolve. On the 3rd day, he called to tell me that his lawyer wanted a public meeting Saturday, noon, at the town registry, with notaries and witnesses. He said it like a victor declares a prize. I agreed immediately. When I hung up, I stood in the middle of the kitchen and let the decision settle. I could sign. I could hand over a piece of myself as an offering to keep a marriage that had become a negotiation. Or I could refuse. But refusal would not be enough. If I was going to refuse outright, I needed to be deliberate, to ensure that refusal would not be dismissed as obstinacy but understood as resistance. I would show him that his threat, the paperwork, the ultimatum, would blow back insistently if he tried to take what did not rightfully belong to him. If he wanted the public, then I would give him the public. I would make the registry my stage. I would bring my brothers, my lawyers, and my truth. I would invite journalists. If he believed victory was optics, I would ensure those optics exposed him. Saturday shimmered like a pressure cooker. My brothers and I arrived at the registry early, hands clenched like we had something to hold on to beyond the paper, a shared past, a common lineage, and a stubborn streak of loyalty. The lawyer he'd hired eyed us coolly. His tally of witnesses looked neat on a clipboard. Notaries adjusted their pens. The registry clerk checked her watch, as if the hour mattered more than the stakes. He walked in late, as if timing his arrival would demonstrate power. He wore a blazer I'd never seen him wear, something that made him look more than usual like a man who belonged in boardrooms. He smiled at us, that same practiced half-smile, and then placed the document on the table. "Let's be efficient," he said. "We all have lives." My brother Tom's jaw clenched. "We have a legacy," he said. "Dad's. We'll protect it." The lawyer slid the document across toward me in a way that suggested he expected compliance. Cameras, yes. The registry had allowed one local journalist in at my request. Adjusted, pens poised. The registry walls were very white, very official. It was all too clean. The lawyer read the paragraph aloud, perfect enunciation that stripped nuance from meaning. "The transferring party, hereinafter referred to as he said." He paused intentionally on the words that would bind us. The finality in his tone made my teeth ache. I looked around the room. Men in suits, a clerk in a cardigan, a small body of witnesses who'd never witnessed anything like this in our town. There was a hum, a current, as if some unseen machine was determining whether family could be broken into line items. "I will not sign," I said. "Not dramatic, just steady. Not now. And not under these terms." He frowned and leaned in. "You agreed." "No," I cut in. "You presented me with options, and one of them was to sign a deed that reassigned property not belonging solely to me. There are legal questions here about inheritance rights and the implications of marital property versus family trusts." I felt the room tilt in my favor, as if the exactness of the words made the law audible to everyone there. "We'll take it to a court if necessary." His face hardened. "You're making this personal." "It is personal," Tom said quietly. "This is our family land." The registry clock ticked. The journalist in the corner scribbled faster. Cameras leaned in, catching every flicker of the small courtroom drama. He opened his mouth, likely to threaten or cajole, but something shifted. The harm of optics. It was no longer a private decision. It was a spectacle. And spectators' truth is merciless. That day I learned a new language, one where quiet resistance, joined with deliberate legality and public presence, could topple the kind of soft tyranny he had begun to exercise in our home. It was not flashy. It was not vindictive. It was a steady, relentless application of facts, law, and pride. Weeks would come, depositions, subpoenas, the slow, careful peeling back of the narrative he'd hoped to control. He would try to spin. His brothers would squirm. The local paper would run an editorial about family versus modern marriage. Quietly, steadily, my plan would unfurl. If revenge is the word people want, then yes. I would make him regret the day he thought he could reduce me to a signature. But what I wanted more than regret was reclamation. To restore that which he had tried to reassign. To make clear that a home is not a commodity to be traded in the small hours. As the first leaves of autumn drifted down the street outside, I felt something long dormant stir inside me. It was not hatred alone. It was the cool, patient machinery of someone who refuses to be measured by another person's greed. It was the beginning of a campaign, long, exact, and surgical. He had given me a choice. I had chosen to answer in kind, not with immediate fury, but with a plan that would take his threat into the light and keep it there until the bones of his argument had been thoroughly picked clean. And when the court called my case, when the lawyers filed for emergency injunctions, and the town's whispers grew into legal thunder, I would be ready. The court summons arrived with the cold efficiency of bureaucracy, stamped, dated, and impossible to ignore. When I opened it, the paper felt heavier than its weight. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the beginning of something that would either burn the last of his leverage or give him the legal muscle to carve a map of ownership across everything that meant home. We filed the injunction that afternoon. My lawyer moved with the kind of purpose that makes people trust the law, methodical, calm, like a surgeon preparing an operating room. There was a rhythm to the paperwork, a kind of music where the right word at the right time could change the course of someone's life. I became obsessed with details. Dates, receipts, texts, the times he'd suggested restructuring, while I was exhausted after night shifts and too forgiving. If coercion had a vocabulary, we were going to recite it until the judge could see the pattern. The local paper ran a subdued piece on the hearing, titled "Family Dispute Escalates to Court." It was sandwiched between a story about a new development project and a column about pumpkin spice season. It didn't capture the gravity I felt, but it did put our conflict into the public record. People at the farmer's market looked my way with curious, polite expressions. My brothers called more often, checking in, sometimes speaking in that low, urgent voice that means fear is close to the surface. It was during one of those calls that Tom said, quietly, "You were brave to do this publicly." I felt his pride like a warm hand on my shoulder. "Not brave," I corrected. "Deliberate. Heaven knows I never wanted my family in the headlines." But the privateness of his contingency had been a weapon. Bringing light on it cut the blade in half. Discovery began like peeling an onion, layers and layers of documents, declarations, emails, affidavits. Daniel's camp answered with the precise anger of the accused. He blamed miscommunication. He said he only wanted to restructure financing, to keep property taxes manageable, and to invest in improvements for all of us. His brothers, stoic, measured, testified to the same story: practicality, not opportunism. We sliced through those statements with a forensics team. The accountant my lawyer recommended had eyes like a hawk and a soft voice that made numbers feel like truth. She found transfers that lined up suspiciously with the dates Daniel had begun pushing the deed. She found a shell company with initials that matched his brother Michael's middle name, a small trust that had suddenly become active right after we bought new furniture. The money moved in the same circles his story had promised it didn't touch. Once the pattern was visible, the narrative dropped away from his lips like a costume. Duress was no longer just a word we were hoping to use. It was a climate we could show. Recorded phone calls where he would pause and insist we decide quickly. Emails he'd sent with phrases like, "This'll be easier if we handle it inside the family." And the text thread with his lawyer suggesting language that effectively put the property at risk. We also found something else: witnesses. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but ordinary people who'd seen him perform the soft coercion of charm. A neighbor who remembered how he had joked about paperwork at a barbecue. A contractor who claimed he'd been asked to sign an early lien and then quietly removed it. The proofs were small by themselves. Together, they became a mosaic of intent. He tried to counterattack. Men like him always do. He could be charming on video when he wanted to be, articulate, wounded in a way that inspired sympathy. He hired a PR firm that spun an empathetic family man narrative across morning shows. A couple working through disagreements, they called it. He leaked pieces to local radio hosts, whispering about greedy siblings and a wife who preferred drama to reason. In a world that loves simple stories, his version threatened to be the one that stuck. The trick was to never let his narrative breathe. For every carefully crafted soundbite he fed to a sympathetic host, we had a dossier. Our approach wasn't to shout louder, but to be quieter and more meticulous. Where he planted a rumor, we planted evidence. Where he offered a tearful interview, we offered a bank statement. People respond to resonance. Facts have a peculiar, wearying truthfulness that makes spin look obscene. I began sleeping in the spare room above the garage some nights, because I wanted to be close to the house, to feel the land beneath my feet like an ally. At odd hours I'd walk the property with a flashlight, run my fingertips along the fence posts and the weathered porch rail. This place was older than his entitlement. It hummed with the lives of the people who had lived inside it. My father's stubborn repairs, my mother's baking, the summer nights where we'd listen to crickets and the creek. That hum became my steadying force. The psychological blows grew sharper. He tried small cruelties, taking the kids to his parents for long weekends without telling me, whispering in public about simplifying the estate for the children. He called on our friends, asking for moral support that was thinly veiled as concern. Once, at a party, he cornered me with a grin and a glass of wine, saying loudly enough for a few people to hear, "You set a dangerous precedent, Emma. You can't just take every fight to the press." The words were meant to shame me into silence. But every public hiss he made drove me further into resolve. I learned not to respond in anger in front of people. Anger is honest and loud and can be used against you. I learned the art of a small, precise smile. Let him be the bitter one. Let him be the man whose people were whispering that his patience had a limit, and whose limit had now become his undoing. And then came the deposition where he tried to break me. The room smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and nerves. The opposing counsel was soft-spoken but relentless, lobbed questions that were traps, small and precise. When did you first hear about the restructuring? Did you seek independent counsel before agreeing? Was there any benefit to you or your brothers to sign financial, emotional, otherwise? I answered each question with calm. I recited dates like a litany. I read from the texts we'd kept. I didn't let my eyes wander. And when he tried to paint me as unstable, as someone prone to drama, I let the facts hold. There is a rare power in controlled composure. It forces the aggressor to look like an overreacher and the accused to look like someone who has endured. The judge set a temporary order preventing any transfers from taking place until a final hearing. That injunction was a small legal victory, but more importantly, it was a political one. It bought us time. Time for the truth to marinate. Time for people who mattered, neighbors, family, friends, even members of his own social circle who didn't like being lied to see the way the man they thought they knew had been guiding his narrative. As the days folded into months, we created a rhythm. Court-related activity in the mornings, depositions and evidence review in the afternoons, family dinners at night where my brothers and I tried to keep things normal for the kids. I returned to work when I could, because there is a kind of salvation in being useful to something outside drama. My colleagues treated me with a careful, new respect. People wanted to know how a woman could be so composed under pressure. I told them the truth in small, dry laughs. This is what happens when you're told to choose between your heartbeat and a spreadsheet. He started making mistakes. The pressure revealed old habits, greed, impatience, and the kind of panoramic arrogance that thinks a court can be bullied like a roomful of interns. He filed motions that made no legal sense, sent emails that were tone-deaf and damning, and above all, he forgot that people notice when someone is changing the rules. People do not enjoy that, they resent it. His brothers, who had once nodded along, grew quieter at meetings, with one of them, Michael, calling my brother in private to ask how the family had become so fractured. The web he had spun to entangle us began to look like a net that might catch him. And then a strange thing happened. Members of his own extended family began to approach my brothers. Loose sympathies turned into admissions of discomfort. An aunt confessed that she had always thought the paperwork pushed too fast. A cousin revealed that their father had hinted at misgivings the night before he died. These were small betrayals to the narrative he wanted, but they were crucial because they signaled the erosion of the community he counted as his base. People's loyalty has limits. It bends at the weight of obvious manipulation. At one hearing, the judge asked us all to consider mediation. He wanted to avoid a full-blown trial if possible. The room breathed a brief sigh of relief. Mediation means a private table rather than media glare. To Daniel, this must have seemed like salvation. To me, the offer was simply another move on the board. I agreed to meet but insisted on two things: that lawyers be present and that no agreements be made without full documentation and independent counsel for my brothers. The mediator was a tall man with a voice like gravel and the patience of someone who'd seen many relationships come unstitched. In the high-ceilinged room where we sat, our positions felt like colored flags, mine blue with resolve, his red with insistence. He tried to balance the bones of the dispute, asking open questions, but it was clear he was inclined toward settlement. "Why let this destroy the family?" he asked at one point, looking from me to Daniel. "Because sometimes people have to be stopped before they normalize their cruelty," I wanted to say. But what I said instead was quieter, because the record needs to be clear. If someone used pressure to arrange transfers, that needs to be acknowledged. It's amazing how much force there is in the plain language of truth. The mediator asked Daniel for specifics on why the transfers were necessary. He delivered the polished speech: taxes, future-proofing, bringing both families together for stability. He presented projections of improved property value and assurances that the family would be protected. His words floated like promises. Promises are beautiful until they become contracts. In the end, mediation yielded nothing decisive. Daniel refused to back down unless given immediate control in the short term. We refused to concede anything without ironclad guarantees and independent financial oversight. The mediator's shoulders sagged. "The court will decide," he said. That's when the campaign pivoted. Legal battles are slow. They glaze over in the public eye. But humans are visual creatures. So we began to tell a different kind of truth, one that wasn't combative but persuasive. We submitted photos to the court and to the local paper. My father's tools neatly arranged on a pegboard, years of family receipts with grocery lists in slanted handwriting. Everything that showed a life had been made in the house, not earned overnight. We printed testimonies from neighbors who'd watched the transformation of our family home over decades. The story became one of continuity versus calculated extraction. The town began to take notice. Coffee shop conversations, they are where reputations actually live, turned. People who had once nodded politely at Daniel's small talk now spoke in cautious tones, asking their friends whether they'd seen the new evidence. When community groups that Daniel used to attend began to murmur, I realized our strategy was working. It wasn't just the law that would deliver justice. It was the slow moral pressure of a town recognizing bad faith. This isn't a story of fireworks. It's the story of a long, grinding reveal, an almost surgical unmasking of a man who thought property law could be his personal advantage. It's a story of how publicness, properly orchestrated, can be an antidote to private coercion. There were nights I wanted to quit, times I sat at my kitchen table with a blank stare and thought about packing a bag, driving until the road felt new. But then I'd hear my son giggle in the next room, or Tom would text something helpful, or I'd discover another line of evidence that made the case stronger. The impulse to run is human. The impulse to remain and to make your stand is rarer, and it feels like gravity. As winter crept over our town, the court date for the final hearing was set. The calendar on my phone felt heavier than it should have. Each day sketched something like a deadline. People said things like, "You're courageous," which annoyed me. Courage is a helpful label for the comfortable to admire. The work of courage is often messy, administrative, the kind of thing that smells faintly of copier toner and courtroom coffee. On the eve of the hearing, I walked the property one last time. The barn door creaked like an old apology. The creek gurgled in its channel. The house gave off the low, settling sound of wood that knows its place in the world. I ran my fingers along the banister, felt the grooves my father's hand had made from years of steady use. I pressed my palm to the countertop that had seen decades of meals, laughter, and arguments. I wanted the land to know I had not abandoned it. Tomorrow, the court would decide whether my resolve and the weight of evidence could stop the slow theft my husband had tried to engineer. Tomorrow, the man who thought of ownership as a transaction would finally have to face the full cost of his calculation. I had no illusions that the legal system was perfect. It isn't. But sometimes it can be enough when combined with truth, solidarity, and a community's refusal to be silent. I slept poorly that night, but I slept. Dawn came with a thin, silver light that felt like an omen. Spare, honest, unadorned. I dressed in the clothes I'd chosen not for spectacle, but for quiet authority. Court is theater of a different kind, less glamour, more stakes. When I walked into the courtroom the next morning, my brothers at my side, my lawyer at the ready, I felt like every small decision we had made, every document saved, every call recorded, had brought me to that precise moment. He sat across from me, wearing a face that tried on contrition like a borrowed coat. The judge listened. The attorneys spoke. Evidence was laid out like a map. The air in the courtroom was thin, thick with consequence. At the end, the judge did not hand down a theatrical verdict. He did something quieter but more decisive. He issued a ruling that the attempted transfers were void due to demonstrated duress, and that any further action regarding the property would require unanimous consent from all beneficiaries. I felt a weight lift, not like triumph, but like rescued air. My brothers hugged me in the hallway outside, faces wet with relief and something like pride. The town would gossip. History would, in its own slow way, file this away as yet another legal wrangle. But to me, it felt like I had tuned the world back to a frequency where truth and family mattered more than convenience and appetite. He later appealed. People sometimes ask if I wanted to humiliate him. I didn't. The best revenge is, I think, making the world intolerant of the behavior that produced the harm. The appeal was another extension of the same process. More lawyers, more paperwork, more tiny reveals. In the end, our townspeople and the steady evidence were more than enough. The finality of the decision was not the end of my story. It was a chapter closed with a careful pen. After the court, life did something remarkable. It began to fill the empty corners. The kids painted a mural in the playroom. My brothers and I brought the old garden back to life. We found ways to make the house speak of us without loading it with memories that felt like traps. We planted a maple tree in the yard in Dad's memory, and when its leaves burst green the following spring, it felt like a benediction. He moved out a few months later to a small apartment in the city. I saw him once, faded and hollow, driving past the market in an old sedan. For a moment he looked like a character from my old life, a man who'd believed his charm could outweigh consequence. I felt nothing but a soft, cold compassion. What I had learned was not a lesson in winning so much as one in endurance. In the quiet after, in the life that returned, I found not just relief but a new definition of myself. I was not merely a woman who had fought for property. I was an architect of boundaries, a protector of legacy, and a mother who had shown her children what it meant to stand when things try to pull you down. And there, after the long grind, the small victories, the papered evidence, and the slow unraveling, revenge was not the glittering star I had imagined. Instead, it was the small room in which we read a bedtime story together. The sound of my son's laugh, the warmth of the kitchen on a weekday morning. It was quieter, harder to film, but better. It was the life I had chosen on my terms. When he first said it, either get your share from your brothers, or get out of this house, the words sliced through me like broken glass. The man who once promised to protect me was now the one threatening to throw me out. For a moment, I just stared at him, my mind struggling to keep up with the cruelty dripping from his voice. This was not the same man I married 7 years ago. Back then, Michael was kind, soft-spoken, ambitious in the way that made me believe he'd build a future with me, not against me. But as the years went by, something dark began to creep in, a hunger for more, a bitterness that seemed to grow every time he compared his life to my brother's. He stood in the middle of our living room now, his tie loose, his eyes sharp with frustration. You know your father left you something. You have every right. Why should your brothers have it all while we struggle? I tried to reason with him, my voice trembling. Michael, my father's property is for all of us. He trusted my brothers to handle it until I needed it. We don't need to fight over it. He laughed, cold and humorless. We don't need to fight? Easy for you to say. You've never had to work for anything. Your family gave you everything, and now you're too proud to ask for your share? You'd rather watch me drown. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words echoed again and again, weaving through my thoughts like poison. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, leaving behind the bitter scent of cologne and a silence that felt heavier than the walls themselves. I went to the mirror, staring at my reflection, at the woman who had been taught to endure, to keep peace, to hold her marriage together no matter how hard it got. But deep inside, something was shifting. Something fierce, something tired of being silent. Days turned into weeks. Michael grew colder, more distant. He stopped coming home early, stopped eating dinner with me. Sometimes, I'd hear whispers through his phone, low and urgent, cut off when I entered the room. Then came the night that broke everything. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that made the world feel blurred and hidden. I heard his car pull up and, for a brief second, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe tonight he'd be kind. Maybe we could talk. But when he walked in, drenched and furious, I knew that hope was a fool's dream. I'm done, he said simply. If you won't do what's necessary for this marriage, then I don't see a point anymore. My throat went dry. What are you saying? He threw a document onto the coffee table, divorce papers. You can keep your pride. I'll keep the house. I felt my knees weaken. Michael, please, this isn't, don't. He interrupted sharply. You've made your choice. You chose your family over your husband. Don't expect me to stay and watch. That night, after he left, I broke. I sat on the floor with the papers in my hand, tears falling silently as the clock ticked away. My father's picture stared down from the wall, the man who taught me strength, fairness, and never to beg for respect that wasn't freely given. And as I looked at his face, something inside me hardened. No more silence. No more pleading. If Michael wanted to play dirty, he was about to learn who I really was. The next morning, I drove to my family's old estate. My brothers, Mark and Daniel, were surprised to see me. They thought I was visiting for peace, but I had a plan. Not to take from them, but to protect what was mine. Michael thought I was naive, that I'd never fight back. But what he didn't know was that I had been keeping records. financial statements, transfers, hidden investments under his name. All the little secrets he thought I'd never notice. And I was ready to use every single one of them. The following days were a blur of icy determination and silent strategy. Michael thought I'd crawl to my brothers, crying for help. He thought I'd beg for forgiveness or maybe agree to his terms just to stay in that house. But instead, I smiled politely, packed a suitcase, and walked out with nothing but my dignity. He didn't even look up when I closed the door. That told me everything I needed to know. My car cut through the rain, headlights slicing the darkness as I drove to my childhood home. My brothers, Mark, steady and responsible, and Daniel, sharp but impulsive, opened the door with surprise. "Claire? What's wrong?" Mark asked. I managed a shaky smile. "I just need a place for a few days." They didn't press for details that night. But in the quiet of my old bedroom, the memories came rushing back. The smell of cedar from the closet. The framed photo of our father on the nightstand. His words echoed in my mind: strength doesn't always mean fighting loud. Sometimes it means standing so firm that no one can move you. And I realized, this wasn't just about Michael anymore. It was about every man who thought kindness was weakness, who believed silence meant surrender. The next morning, I began to dig. Michael had always been meticulous about money, or so he wanted everyone to believe. But I remembered little inconsistencies: sudden bank alerts, business dinners that didn't add up, and a mysterious new car he claimed was on loan from a friend. I logged into our joint account and froze. Almost $80,000 had been moved over the past 6 months. Small transfers, split into several unknown accounts. I took screenshots of everything: statements, receipts, emails. Then I found the shell company name on one of the statements: LM Consulting. That was the moment my hands started to shake, not with fear, but with adrenaline. LM, Liam and Michael. Liam was his business partner, the one who introduced him to new investment opportunities. But Liam wasn't just a business partner. He was also the husband of one of my college friends, Carla. Something clicked in my mind. I called Carla. Her voice trembled when she picked up. "Claire, oh my God. I've been meaning to call you. What's going on?" I asked, my tone sharp, though my heart was pounding. "It's Michael," she whispered. "I don't know how to tell you this, but he and Liam have been moving money into offshore accounts. They're planning to start their own firm under your father's estate name. Michael told everyone you were going to cash out your share soon, so he could use it as an investment cover." The room spun. Betrayal wasn't new to me, but hearing the pieces fit together made my stomach twist. He hadn't just wanted me to take my inheritance for greed. He wanted control, the kind that would let him use my family's name to build his empire, with me as his silent partner or disposable scapegoat. I thanked Carla, my voice steady even as anger boiled beneath the surface. I hung up and stared out the window at the gray morning light filtering through the trees. The rain had stopped, but thunder still rumbled faintly in the distance. That was fine. I didn't mind storms anymore. That evening, I met with my father's old attorney, Mr. Whitman, a shrewd, kind-eyed man in his 60s who had known our family for decades. "Claire," he said after I laid everything out, "you have enough evidence to do serious damage to him. But I have to ask, what do you want out of this? Money? Justice?" I met his gaze without flinching. "Neither," I said. "I want him to lose what he tried to steal. His reputation, his business, his comfort. I want him to know what it feels like to be powerless." He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Then we'll make it happen." Over the next several weeks, I worked quietly, methodically, with Whitman's help. We filed for divorce, but not before I submitted an emergency injunction freezing Michael's assets and company accounts. The look on his face when he got served must have been priceless, but I didn't see it. What I did see, a few days later, was his name splashed across a financial blog headline: "Local entrepreneur accused of fraudulent transfers and misuse of marital funds." The article detailed everything: his shell companies, the offshore accounts, the suspicious movement of funds. And the source? Anonymous, of course. But I knew. Michael called me that night. His voice was raw, trembling with panic. "Claire, what did you do?" I let the silence stretch before replying, calm and slow. "What do you mean? Don't play dumb. The firm's frozen. Investors are pulling out. I'm ruined." "Maybe next time," I said softly, "you'll think twice before underestimating your wife." He cursed, screamed, threatened, but it didn't matter. The more he yelled, the calmer I became. The courtroom battle that followed was brutal. Michael tried everything: manipulation, fake tears, even lying under oath. But with every document I presented, his lies unraveled. My brothers testified, Carla provided a statement, and the judge's expression grew darker with every passing minute. In the end, the verdict was swift and merciless. The company was dissolved, the assets redistributed, and the house, the one he'd tried to throw me out of, was legally transferred to me. Michael's face when the judge said, "Mrs. Thompson is hereby awarded full ownership," was something I'll never forget. His lips parted, his eyes wide, as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. When the gavel struck, I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered quietly in the hearts of those who had been wronged, and this time, it whispered for me. As I walked out of the courthouse, the cold spring air hit my face, and I felt lighter than I had in years. My brothers waited outside. Mark hugged me tight. "Dad would be proud," he said softly. I smiled faintly. He taught me well. That night, I stood on the porch of the house that was once his and whispered into the quiet sky, "You tried to break me, Michael. But all you did was teach me how to win." The night after the verdict, I didn't sleep. Not because I was restless, but because, for the first time in months, I didn't have to fight anymore. The battle that had consumed my life had ended, and I was still standing. But peace is strange after war. It doesn't come easily. I sat in the living room, lights dimmed, with a glass of wine in my hand. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of wood. I remembered how Michael used to fill this room with his voice, confident, commanding, always just a little too loud, as if he needed everyone to know he was the most important person there. Now, that echo was gone. And yet, part of me still felt haunted by him. Revenge had given me justice, but it hadn't erased the memories: the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't good enough, the way he tried to make me small so he could feel big. The humiliation, the loneliness, the fear. I wasn't just reclaiming my house or my name. I was reclaiming myself. A few days later, I returned to work at the design firm I'd once left behind to support his dream. The same office that had looked so dull before now felt alive again. My colleagues welcomed me with cautious smiles. They'd heard about the case, of course. Everyone had. But there was one person who approached me differently: Emma, a quiet intern who'd started a month before I left. She pulled me aside during lunch. "Mrs. Thompson," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, what you did. It inspired me. My boyfriend's been trying to control my finances, too. I didn't think I could stand up for myself until I read your story online." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were fierce. I reached out and squeezed her hand. You don't need to be anyone's shadow, Emma. Don't ever let them convince you that you're less because you care. For the first time, I realized that maybe my story wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the power that women are too often told to give away. Still, not everyone was happy for me. The local gossip circles were buzzing. Some said I had set Michael up. Others said I should have just left quietly. People always find a way to twist a woman's victory into something ugly. But I didn't care. Because for once, I wasn't afraid to be the villain in someone else's story, especially when I knew I was the hero in my own. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. One evening, I got a call from Liam, Michael's old business partner. His voice was cautious, almost defeated. "Claire, I need to tell you something. Michael's been trying to contact you." I froze. "Why?" "He says he's sorry. But that's not all. He's been talking to a journalist. Trying to spin a story about how you betrayed him." My stomach clenched. Of course he is. He wants sympathy. He's painting himself as a man who lost everything because of his greedy wife. He's planning to go on a podcast next week. I sighed. "Let him." Liam hesitated. "You're not going to stop him?" "No," I said slowly, smiling to myself. "I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, attention." The next few days, I worked quietly behind the scenes. With a few calls and a discreet favor from a journalist friend, I ensured that when Michael went live on that podcast, I'd already spoken my truth first. A full-length interview aired the morning of his appearance, not about scandal or gossip, but about financial abuse, manipulation, and empowerment. It featured me, my attorney, and even Carla, the woman who had helped expose the fraud. The title read, "From Betrayal to Power: The Woman Who Fought Back." It went viral. Within hours, clips of my calm, firm responses were everywhere. I didn't slander him. I didn't even mention his name directly. I just told the truth, how love turned into control, how silence became a weapon, and how I found strength when I had nothing left. By the time Michael's podcast aired that afternoon, the public had already made up their minds. His crocodile tears didn't move anyone. Every time he tried to talk about me, the hosts pressed him with facts I had provided days earlier. He was cornered, exposed, and humiliated. And me? I sat on my couch, sipping coffee, watching his downfall unfold like a movie I'd already seen the ending to. A week later, I received an invitation to speak at a women's empowerment conference in New York. At first, I hesitated. I didn't see myself as an activist. But when I stepped onto that stage and looked at the hundreds of faces watching me, something in me shifted. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a voice. And when I spoke about betrayal, resilience, and the quiet, methodical art of reclaiming your life, there wasn't a sound in the room except for my words. When the applause came, it wasn't thunderous. It was soft, genuine, and healing. Afterward, I stood by the window of my hotel room, the Manhattan skyline glittering before me. I thought of Michael, probably alone, his name now a cautionary tale in business circles. He had tried to build his empire on my silence. But silence, I learned, was only powerful until you chose to break it. I smiled faintly and whispered to myself, "You took everything you could, Michael. But you never understood. I was never yours to destroy." Then I raised my glass to the city lights. To freedom. To vengeance. To peace. And somewhere deep inside, I finally felt it. Not triumph, not rage, but something quieter, stronger. Closure. That night, after the world had gone quiet, and the glow of the city lights spilled through my apartment window, I sat with my glass of red wine, watching the condensation trace lazy paths down the glass. The air smelled faintly of rain, soft, clean, cleansing. I could hear the city breathing below me, the hum of traffic, distant laughter, the faint whisper of a siren cutting through the night. For months, I had dreamed of this, the day I wouldn't have to look over my shoulder, wouldn't have to defend myself, wouldn't have to prove that I wasn't the villain in his story. But peace, I was learning, was not quiet. It was heavy. It sat in the room with me, pressing on my chest, asking the one question I wasn't ready to answer. What now? The phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from an unknown number. You may have fooled everyone, but you'll never win. No name, but I didn't need one. I knew that tone. That self-righteous bitterness. It was Michael. For a moment, my stomach twisted. Old instincts. Fear used to be my first reaction. But not anymore. I stared at the message until it blurred in my vision, then deleted it without a reply. Silence, I realized, was the best form of power. The next morning, I went back to work. My team had prepared a welcome-back breakfast, pastries, flowers, coffee. There was warmth in the air, the kind that felt earned. When I walked in, I saw the subtle glances, the admiration mingled with curiosity. Everyone had heard what happened, but no one dared to mention it. Except for Marcus. Marcus was one of our senior designers, quiet, thoughtful, always dressed in slightly rumpled shirts that somehow made him look intentional rather than careless. He'd been my friend long before my marriage fell apart, though I'd pushed him away when Michael started controlling every aspect of my life. Now, he stood by the window with 2 cups of coffee, one extended toward me. "Welcome back, Claire," he said softly. "You look lighter." I smiled, taking the cup. "Freedom looks good on everyone." He chuckled. "So I've heard. Just glad to see you again. We missed your fire around here." "Guess I had to walk through hell to find it again," I said, half joking. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine with something unspoken, understanding, respect, maybe even something deeper. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost of who I used to be. But freedom wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something new, something Michael could never have predicted. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation to a gala hosted by one of the city's most influential business networks. It was a charity event, coincidentally sponsored by a company Michael once tried to partner with. My name was listed as a guest of honor for my recent philanthropic contributions to women's shelters and empowerment initiatives. When I arrived, the ballroom shimmered with glass chandeliers and laughter. I wore a midnight blue gown, simple but commanding, the kind of elegance that didn't need to shout. As I moved through the room, heads turned. I wasn't Michael's wife anymore. I was Claire Thompson, the woman who rebuilt herself from ashes. Halfway through the night, I saw him. Michael stood near the bar, looking smaller than I remembered. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced by something duller, exhaustion, maybe regret. His suit didn't fit quite right, his tie slightly loosened. When our eyes met across the room, the noise around us seemed to fade. For a moment, I thought he might turn away. But he didn't. He approached me, each step deliberate, like a man walking toward a ghost he wasn't sure was real. "Claire," he said, voice low. "You look incredible." I smiled faintly. "I know." He tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "You've been busy. I saw the interviews, the conference, the articles. You've become quite the celebrity." "Funny," I said, swirling my drink. "You used to say I was too emotional to handle business. Guess emotions make good headlines now." His jaw tightened. I didn't mean, yes, you did, I interrupted. You meant every word. You just didn't expect me to prove you wrong. He exhaled slowly, eyes darting around the room. I made mistakes. But you didn't have to destroy me. I met his gaze, my voice calm but sharp. You destroyed yourself. I just stopped protecting you. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. There was a beat of silence, heavy and deliberate. Then I leaned in slightly, close enough for only him to hear. Do you know what the difference is between you and me, Michael? I whispered. You used people to feel powerful. I lifted myself up so I'd never need to. And with that, I walked away. The applause from across the ballroom signaled the start of the charity auction. I stepped onto the stage as the keynote speaker, my heart steady, my voice clear. I spoke about resilience, not as a concept, but as survival. About women who were told to stay quiet, to be obedient, to sacrifice. I told them that kindness was not weakness, and that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what you survived. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. From the corner of my eye, I saw Michael standing near the exit. He didn't clap. He just watched me with something like awe, or maybe realization, as if seeing, finally, the woman he'd tried so hard to break. After that night, I didn't see him again. Not in person, anyway. I heard rumors, failed business ventures, debt, a reputation in ruins. Sometimes I wondered if he regretted it, if he ever thought about the woman who walked away from his empire and built her own. But the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. Because I had everything he thought I could never have without him: success, peace, and freedom. And most importantly, I had myself. That was the real victory. And sometimes, late at night, when the city lights flickered through my window, I'd smile to myself and think, he tried to take everything from me. But in the end, I took something he could never replace: his legacy. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of quiet victories. Mornings began with black coffee and purpose, not panic. I'd reclaimed my firm, my name, and my control, but I was still haunted by echoes of the woman I used to be. The one who flinched at slammed doors, who second-guessed every decision because someone told her she wasn't enough. That woman was gone. But her shadow lingered. I started therapy again, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand the scars. My therapist, Dr. Alvarez, had eyes like soft embers. She listened in a way that made silence feel safe. "Do you think you've forgiven him?" she asked one afternoon. I thought about it. About the nights I'd sat awake, crying into the pillow so no one would hear. About how he used to make me apologize for his anger. About how, even now, his voice sometimes crawled into my dreams. "No," I said finally. "But I've stopped needing to." She smiled, the kind of small, approving smile that said she understood. That's progress. Forgiveness is overrated anyway. Peace is the real goal. Peace. That word had become my compass. Every choice I made now had to align with it, even the ones that didn't look peaceful from the outside. One morning, an email from my lawyer caught my attention. The subject line read, "Division of assets, final review." Michael had finally signed the settlement. It was the end of a long, vicious battle, the kind that drained not just your bank account, but your soul. For months, his attorneys had tried to paint me as manipulative, unstable, greedy. But when the truth surfaced about his fake invoices, his offshore transfers, his affair with his financial consultant, the court leaned my way. I didn't just win the divorce. I dismantled his narrative. I stared at the PDF of the signed agreement for a long moment before I allowed myself to smile. Half of the business assets were now legally mine, And with the press coverage that followed, clients started calling me, not him. The irony was delicious. That afternoon, I met Marcus for coffee downtown. It had become a ritual for us, a small pocket of normalcy in a life that had been anything but. "You look like someone who just conquered something," he said, sliding a cup across the table. I did. I sipped the coffee, feeling its warmth bloom through me. "The settlement's final. It's over." "Over?" He arched an eyebrow. "Or just beginning?" I smiled. "Depends on how poetic you're feeling today." We laughed, but he wasn't wrong. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a shift, like the universe had finally stopped resisting me and was now waiting to see what I'd do next. I didn't plan revenge in the way people imagine, no wild outbursts, no destruction. My revenge was quiet, elegant, the kind that looked like success. Every deal I closed, every new client I landed, every mention of my company's name in an industry newsletter, it all whispered the same message. You underestimated me. Then, one afternoon, fate handed me the kind of poetic justice you don't plan, it just unfolds. My assistant, Julia, walked into my office holding a tablet. "You might want to see this," she said, tilting the screen toward me. It was an article from a major business site. The headline read, "Former executive faces fraud allegations after divorce scandal." Below it, Michael's face stared back, grainy, unflattering, and utterly defeated. Apparently, one of his former investors had filed a lawsuit claiming misappropriation of funds, something I'd long suspected but couldn't prove during our marriage. Now it was public and the story was spreading fast. Julia's voice was careful. "Do you want to make a statement?" I shook my head slowly, a calm smile playing on my lips. "No. Let the truth do the talking." That night, I poured myself another glass of wine and stood by the window again, watching the city lights flicker like tiny sparks of redemption. I wasn't celebrating his downfall, that part of me had died with the marriage. But I was savoring the silence that came after the storm, the weightless feeling of finally standing in my own story. And somewhere deep inside, I realized something important. My revenge wasn't about making him hurt. It was about showing everyone, that I didn't need him to win. That realization became the foundation of who I was becoming. The woman who no longer apologized for her strength. The woman who could walk into a room and be her own validation. A week later, an invitation arrived for a televised panel on women reclaiming power after betrayal. They wanted me to speak. It felt like a sign, a full-circle moment. But more than that, it felt like a chance to close the last open chapter of my past. Before the show, I sat in the green room, staring into the mirror as the makeup artist finished her work. She was quiet for a while, then said softly, "You've got that look like someone who's about to change everything." I smiled at my reflection, at the steady eyes, the unshaken calm. I already did. When I walked onto that stage, the audience applauded. The lights were bright, the cameras unblinking. But for the first time I didn't feel exposed. I felt seen. I took a deep breath, gripped the microphone, and began to speak. "My story isn't about revenge," I said, my voice clear. "It's about remembering that no one has the right to make you small. And when they try, you don't have to scream. You just have to rise." The applause that followed was thunderous, but inside, all I felt was peace. Because the war was over. And I had won.